3 days after we buried our mother, my sister Renata stood in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, held up a chipped Pyrex casserole dish with a rubber band still wrapped around the lid, and said, "This is what Mom wanted you to have. She told me herself." Then she smiled at the 6 people still lingering in the dining room, the way you smile when you already know you've won, and said, "The beach house is mine. It's in my name. It has been for years." I want to be clear about what I did in that moment, because it matters for everything that comes after. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I set my coffee cup down on the counter, quietly, the way you set something down when you don't want it to break, and I said, "Okay, that's all, just, okay." What Renata didn't know, what none of them knew, not my father, not my Aunt Ferris, not the 2 cousins who'd shown up mostly for the sandwiches, was that our grandmother had spent the last 4 years of her life sitting across from an attorney in a small office above a pharmacy in Belhaven, Maine, making very sure that the thing my sister thought she'd stolen was never actually hers to take. What happened over the next 9 years is the story I want to tell you today, and I promise you, by the end of it, you will understand exactly why I never raised my voice either. Before we get into this, if you are new here, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it costs you nothing. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I read every single one of those, and I love knowing that these stories are landing in living rooms and cars and hospital break rooms all over the world, but only do that if this story actually resonates with you. Welcome back to the channel, where quiet women outlast loud cruelty, and the truth always takes its time but never misses. My name is Cassandra Voss. Everyone but my mother called me Cass. I'm 42 years old now, but this story starts when I was 33 in a town called Belhaven, Maine, population just under 4,000, the kind of place with 1 blinking traffic light, 1 Presbyterian church with white clapboard siding, and a harbor that smelled like low tide and diesel fuel every morning of my childhood. I was the older daughter. Renata was younger by 3 years, and from the time she was old enough to understand that attention was a currency, she understood it better than anyone else in that family. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it the way you'd describe weather. It's just what was true. My mother, Diane, ran the house the way some women run a hotel. Always aware of who was watching, always arranging the furniture of our lives so that it photographed well. She wore pearl earrings to church every Sunday, small ones, a gift from her own mother, and she had a habit of touching them with 2 fingers whenever she was about to say something she didn't quite believe herself. I noticed that habit when I was maybe 9 years old, and I never stopped noticing it. My father, Walter, worked at the shipping office down at the harbor for 31 years. He was not a cruel man. I want to be fair about that. He was a passive one, which in a house like ours amounted to nearly the same thing. When my mother said something unkind to me at the dinner table, my father would look at his plate. When Renata got away with something, skipping curfew, wrecking the family car 2 weeks after getting her license, telling a teacher that her homework had been eaten by our dog when we had never owned a dog, my father would say, "Well, kids will be kids," and reach for the potatoes. There is a memory I still turn over sometimes, the way you'd turn a smooth stone over in your pocket. I was 11. There was a regional science fair at the middle school, and I had spent 6 weeks building a working water filtration model out of sand, charcoal, and gravel layered in a 2-liter soda bottle, testing it every day after school with pond water I collected myself. I won first place in my age division. That same weekend, Renata had a dance recital. A group number, 8-year-olds in matching leotards, 30 seconds of her own solo spin in the middle of a much longer routine. My mother came to the recital. She brought a bouquet of pink carnations and a video camera. She did not come to the science fair. My father drove me, sat in a folding chair in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax, and clapped by himself when they called my name. When we got home that night, my mother was already telling my Aunt Ferris on the phone about how beautifully Renata had held the stage, and nobody in that house asked to see my ribbon. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for an 11-year-old with a homemade water filter. I'm telling you this because that pattern, that precise, repeatable pattern, ran for the next 22 years of my life without a single meaningful interruption, and understanding the pattern is the only way to understand why I did what I eventually did. The one exception in that entire house was my grandmother, June Voss, my father's mother, who lived 11 miles up the coast in a small cedar-shingled cottage with a wraparound porch and a garden she tended in a straw hat that had gone soft and shapeless with age. Grandma June was the only person in my childhood who ever asked me follow-up questions. Not, "How was school?" but, "What did you build today?" And then she would sit still and actually wait for the answer. She had been a legal secretary for almost 40 years, first in Portland and then in a small firm in Belhaven, and she understood paperwork the way some people understand music, instinctively, and with a kind of reverence for what it could protect. She used to tell me, when I was maybe 16, sitting at her kitchen table shelling peas, "Cassie, the people who love you loudest aren't always the people who show up. Watch who shows up. Write it down if you have to. People forget, but paper doesn't." I didn't understand, at 16, that she was training me for something. I understand it now. I became a landscape architect. I want to explain why, because it matters. I like the idea of taking something wild and giving it structure without stripping away what made it beautiful. A discipline built entirely around boundaries that create room to grow rather than boundaries that choke a thing off. I put myself through college on scholarships and a part-time job drafting site plans for a firm in Portland, and by the time I was 29, I had my own small practice, 3 employees, and a modest but steady client list of homeowners and a few municipal parks departments along the coast. My mother's assessment of this career, delivered at a 4th of July barbecue in front of my aunt and 2 of her church friends, was this: "Cassie plays in the dirt for a living. Renata's the one doing something with her life." Renata, at the time, had been fired from her 3rd consecutive sales job and was living rent-free in my parents' finished basement. I said nothing. I ate my potato salad. My father reached for the corn. Grandma June died when I was 31. I was the one who found her, actually. I'd driven up on a Saturday to help her with a leak in the porch roof, and I let myself in through the kitchen door the way I always did, and I found her in her armchair by the window, looking like she'd simply fallen asleep with a paperback open on her lap. The medical examiner said her heart had likely stopped sometime in the early morning. She was 86. It was, by every measure, a peaceful death, and I have tried to hold on to that fact on the harder nights since. What I did not know that Saturday morning, what none of us knew, was that 4 years earlier, Grandma June had walked into the small law office above the pharmacy on Harbor Street and sat down across from an attorney named Marcus Feld, and had begun, methodically, patiently, the way she did everything, to make absolutely certain that the cottage on the coast road, along with a modest but real investment account she'd built quietly over 3 decades, would never end up anywhere near my mother's pearl earrings or my sister's outstretched hand. My mother died 2 years after Grandma June, of a stroke, fast and merciless, in the parking lot of the Belhaven Shop and Save on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I want to be honest about something here, because this isn't a story about hating my mother. I grieved her. I grieved the version of her I kept hoping would show up, the mother who might eventually notice me the way she noticed Renata. That grief is its own separate thing from the story I'm telling you, and I want you to understand I'm allowed to hold both at once. The funeral was at the same white clapboard church where she'd worn her pearl earrings every Sunday of her adult life. 40-some people came. My father sat in the front pew looking hollowed out, genuinely, and for the only time in the whole ordeal, I felt something soften toward him. Afterward, at the house, there was the reception, casseroles and cold cuts, and a sheet cake from the bakery on Main Street. Renata, who had flown in from Charlotte, North Carolina, 2 days before, wearing a black dress that looked new and a pair of sunglasses she kept pushing up into her hair even indoors, had appointed herself in charge of handling things, which mostly meant deciding who got to keep what. It was maybe an hour into the reception when she made her announcement. I remember exactly where I was standing, by the kitchen counter near the window that looked out over the backyard where my mother used to hang laundry, when Renata walked in holding that old Pyrex dish, the one with the faded orange flowers on the lid and a rubber band holding a crack together, and said, loud enough for the room, "Mom wanted you to have this, Cass. She told me herself, before she passed. Sentimental value, you know how she was." Then, barely pausing, still smiling, she said, "And I should mention, since we're all here, the beach house up on the coast road is mine. Grandma left it to me years ago. It's already in my name. I just didn't want there to be any confusion later. I want to describe the room for you, because the room is part of the story." My Aunt Ferris stopped mid-chew on a deviled egg. My cousin Beth looked at her husband. My father, from the doorway, said nothing at all, which by then I understood as its own kind of answer, and I stood there holding a chipped casserole dish with a rubber band around it in the house where I'd built a water filtration system nobody came to see, and I said, "Okay." I set the dish down on the counter. Gently. I did not want it to break, even though, looking back, I'm not sure why that mattered to me in that moment. Maybe because it was the one physical object in that entire house that had ever been handed to me directly, even if it was handed to me as an insult. I did not argue with Renata that day. I did not correct her. I want to be honest with you about why. I already knew something she didn't. 4 months earlier, I had received a call from Marcus Feld's office in Belhaven, informing me that as executor of my grandmother's estate, a position I hadn't known I held until that phone call, there were documents I needed to come in and review. I had gone in, quietly, on a Thursday afternoon, told no one, and sat across the same desk my grandmother had once sat across, and learned exactly what she had built for me, 4 years before her death, without telling a single soul. The cottage on the coast road, the one Renata was, at that very funeral reception, calling the beach house. The one she'd apparently told her fiancé and half of Charlotte, North Carolina, belonged to her, was never Grandma June's to give away in the casual verbal way Renata described it. It had been placed in an irrevocable trust 4 years before my grandmother's death, with a single named beneficiary, held for my benefit, with instructions that it not be disclosed to any family member until Grandma June's passing, so that no one may treat this gift as a bargaining chip while I am still alive to witness the bargaining. That was Marcus Feld's phrase, reading directly from Grandma June's letter of instruction, and I remember sitting in that office and understanding, all at once, that my grandmother had spent her last years quietly building me a life raft, in complete silence, specifically because she had always known, exactly what kind of house I'd grown up in. So when Renata stood in my mother's kitchen and told a room full of grieving relatives that the beach house belonged to her, she was, in fact, describing property that had never been hers at all. What she actually possessed was something else entirely, something I wouldn't fully understand the shape of for another several weeks, and something considerably more damaging to her than she could have imagined on the day she handed me a cracked casserole dish and called it sentiment. I'm going to pause here for just a second. If this story is hitting close to home for you, if you've ever been the one handed the leftover dish while someone else got the deed, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. I promise you it's worth staying for what comes next. And if you've ever been the responsible one who got overlooked at exactly the moment it mattered most, type the word enough in the comments below. I read every single one. Now back to the story. Here is what I pieced together over the following months, partly from Marcus Feld's careful, methodical explanations, and partly from documents I requested directly once I understood what I was looking for. My grandmother's actual unrestricted asset, the Coast Road cottage, 3 bedrooms, cedar shingle, a wraparound porch with a view of the harbor mouth, sat in the trust in my name, untouched, exactly as she'd arranged it. Renata had never had legal title to that property, not for one single day. What Renata did have, it turned out, was something my grandmother had drawn up years earlier and never gotten around to revising. A small joint account, opened when Renata was in her early 20s, and going through what my grandmother had generously called a rough patch, meant to help cover a semester of community college tuition that Renata had, in fact, never used for tuition at all. That account had roughly $14,000 remaining in it at the time of Grandma June's death, and it did pass to Renata cleanly, without dispute, exactly as written. The confusion, or more precisely, the story Renata had constructed and told to her fiancé, her friends in Charlotte, and eventually a mortgage broker, was that she had conflated that small account with the cottage itself and had spent the better part of 2 years describing herself, to anyone who'd listen, as the owner of the family beach house. She had, I later learned, even used photographs of the cottage, taken during a visit years earlier, in a listing she quietly put together with a real estate agent in Belhaven, testing the waters to see what the property might sell for, nearly 18 months before our mother's death. I want to be very careful here about what I did and didn't do with this information, because this is the part of the story where people expect me to have marched into that funeral reception and torn the whole thing down in front of everyone. I didn't. I want to be honest about why. I didn't have all the facts yet, and more importantly, I didn't need to win anything in that kitchen. The trust had already done the winning, quietly, 4 years earlier, while my grandmother was still alive to make sure it couldn't be undone. So I let Renata believe, for the better part of a year, that she owned a house she had never owned. I know how that sounds. I've thought about it a great deal since, and here is what I've settled on. That was not cruelty on my part. That was simply the absence of my obligation to correct someone else's story on their timeline instead of mine. I had spent 33 years managing everyone else's comfort in that family. For the first time, I let a fact sit exactly where it was, in a filing cabinet in an office above a pharmacy, and I went back to my life. I took over the cottage's small maintenance needs quietly through a local property manager, paid the modest taxes on it through the trust's own funds exactly as Marcus Feld had structured, and visited it twice that first year, alone, sitting on the porch in the evenings with a glass of wine, watching the harbor the way my grandmother used to. I did not renovate it. I did not announce anything. I let a year pass. I want to slow down here, because the waiting itself is a part of this story that I think gets skipped over too quickly in most tellings, and it was, in its own way, the hardest part. For most of that year, I did not tell a single person outside of Marcus Feld's office what I knew. Not my closest friend Priya, who I'd known since graduate school, and who eventually became one of the only people I trusted with the whole account. Not my father, not yet. I went to work every morning, drew up planting plans for a municipal park expansion in South Portland, met with clients about drainage issues and retaining walls, and came home most nights to an apartment that felt, for the first time in my adult life, entirely mine. Quiet, undisturbed, unmonitored by anyone's expectations. I want to describe something small that happened during that year because it tells you more about the shape of my grief than any single dramatic scene could. About 4 months after the funeral, I drove up to the cottage alone on a Saturday in April, let myself in with a key Marcus Feld's office had given me, and sat in my grandmother's old armchair by the window. The same chair, I later confirmed with the medical examiner's report, in which she had died. I sat there for almost 2 hours, not crying, just sitting, watching the tide come in below the porch, feeling the particular ache of understanding, all at once, both how much she had loved me and how carefully she had needed to hide that love from the rest of the family in order to protect it. I thought about the science fair that day. I thought about the cracked casserole dish. I thought about how strange it was that the person who had seen me most clearly in that entire family was the one who'd had to die before I could understand the full extent of what she'd built for me. I called Marcus Feld again that same month, not about anything new, but because I wanted to understand the mechanics of it all more completely, how an irrevocable trust actually worked, what would happen if I ever wanted to sell, what obligations, if any, I had to disclose its existence to anyone. He was patient with me. He'd known my grandmother for almost 15 years, he told me, and he said something I've never forgotten. She used to tell me that some people build walls to keep others out. She built this one to keep you in, safe, on the inside of something for once. I didn't have anything to say to that, I just sat with it. It was during that same period that I began, slowly, to understand something about my own inheritance that had nothing to do with money at all. My grandmother had given me a habit, not just a house, the habit of documenting things quietly, of trusting paper over promises, of building protections years before anyone might need them, and saying nothing about it until the moment they mattered. I started keeping better records in my own business that year. I started, for the first time, actually reading the fine print on my own contracts instead of skimming them. It was a small shift, almost invisible from the outside, but I felt it change something structural in how I moved through the world. Renata's actual crisis, when it finally arrived, had almost nothing to do with me directly, at least not at first. It had to do with her fiancé, a man named Trent, and a business he wanted to open in Charlotte, a wellness and juice bar franchise that required, according to the numbers Renata later admitted to my father, roughly $180,000 in startup capital that neither of them had. Renata's solution, as it turned out, was the Coast Road cottage. Not to sell it outright, she wasn't quite ready to give up the story she'd been telling for 2 years, but to use it as collateral for a home equity line of credit, the kind of financial maneuver where a bank sends someone out to verify title before releasing a single dollar. That verification happened in the spring, roughly 14 months after our mother's funeral. A title search came back, as title searches do, with the actual recorded ownership of the property. An irrevocable trust, established 4 years prior to my grandmother's death, with myself named as sole beneficiary and Marcus Feld's firm listed as trustee. I found out about this not from Renata, but from my father, who called me on a Sunday evening sounding smaller than I'd ever heard him. Renata's bank called her about some paperwork issue with the beach house, he said. She's pretty upset. Says there's some kind of mistake with the deed. I remember standing in my own kitchen, in Portland, holding the phone, and feeling something I want to describe honestly. Not triumph. Something quieter and heavier than that. I said, "There's no mistake, Dad. It's not her house. It's never been her house." There was a long silence. Then he said, "What do you mean it's not her house?" So I told him. Calmly. In full. About the office above the pharmacy. About Grandma June sitting across from Marcus Feld 4 years before she died. about the letter of instruction that said no one should be told while she was still alive to witness the bargaining. I told him about the casserole dish, too, not with anger, just as a fact, the way you'd mention the weather on the day something important happened. That's what I got at the funeral, Dad. A cracked dish with a rubber band around the lid, and Renata got to stand in Mom's kitchen and tell everyone she owned Grandma's house, except she never did. My father didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Your grandmother never told me either." "I know," I said. "I think that was the point." Renata called me 4 days later. Not my father passing along a message. Renata herself for the first time in almost 2 years. I let it ring twice before I picked up, not out of spite, but because I genuinely needed the extra few seconds to steady myself. "There's obviously been some kind of clerical error," she said, before I'd even said hello. "The bank is saying the cottage is in some trust with your name on it, which is insane, because Grandma left me that house. Everyone knows that." I said, "Who told you that, Renata?" "What do you mean, who told me?" It's understood. I've always had it. You've had an account with $14,000 in it that Grandma set up for your community college tuition," I said. "That's what you've always had. The cottage was never yours. It's in a trust Grandma set up 4 years before she died, and I'm the beneficiary. Marcus Feld has all the paperwork. You're welcome to call him yourself." The silence on the other end of the line was longer than any silence I'd ever gotten from Renata in my entire life. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its certainty. Why wouldn't Grandma tell me that? Why would she just give it to you and not say anything? I thought about that question for a moment before I answered it, because I wanted to answer it honestly rather than cruelly, and those are not always the same thing. "I think," I said, "she didn't want either of us treating it like leverage while she was still alive. I think she'd watched enough of how things worked in that house to know that if you or Mom knew I had something, it would become a problem to be managed instead of a gift to be kept quiet, so she kept it quiet." "This isn't fair," Renata said. "I have a business depending on this. Trent and I have already told people about the juice bar. We need that collateral. I want to tell you honestly what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than anything I said. I did not feel vindicated. I felt mostly tired. The specific tiredness of realizing that even now, even faced with a legal fact she could not argue with, my sister's first instinct was still to ask me to solve a problem that her own choices had created, the same way she'd asked me my entire childhood to step back so she could stand in the light. "I'm sorry about the juice bar," I said, and I meant it, in the narrow way you can mean something like that. "But that cottage was never collateral you had the right to offer. That's not something I did to you. That's something that was true the whole time, and none of us knew it." "So you're not going to help," Renata said. "I didn't say that," I told her. "I said the cottage isn't yours to use as collateral. Those are 2 different sentences. Here's where I want to be careful, because this is the part of the story people often expect to turn into something more dramatic than it was. I did not sue my sister. I did not go to my father and demand an apology tour. I did not post anything online, call any relatives, or attend any family gathering with a folder of documents to slap down on a table in front of witnesses, the way you might expect from a story like this. What I did was meet with Marcus Feld again, in the same office above the pharmacy, and ask him a very specific question. What latitude did the trust give me, as beneficiary, to make a decision about the property? Not for Renata's benefit, but because I had, somewhat to my own surprise, started to genuinely want to keep the cottage, live near it, maybe even in it, someday. Marcus told me the trust gave me full discretion. I could sell it, I could occupy it, I could lease it, I could do nothing with it at all for the rest of my life, and the trust would simply continue paying its own modest taxes from the small investment account Grandma June had folded into it. I chose to do something I hadn't expected to choose. I offered my sister a single, narrow kindness, entirely on my own terms, with nothing implied about forgiveness or reconciliation attached to it. I told Marcus to draft a short-term, low-interest personal loan, not from the trust, but from my own savings, for $18,000, roughly what she would have needed to cover the immediate hole in Trent's business plan while they found actual, honest financing elsewhere. Not the full $180,000, not the cottage. $18,000 with a clear repayment schedule, drawn up formally, with an actual signature required. I called Renata back myself to tell her this, rather than letting Marcus's office do it, because I wanted her to hear it directly from me. "I'll lend you $18,000, I said. Not give, lend, with a repayment plan and a signature. That's what I can offer. The cottage isn't part of any negotiation, now or ever." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have turned over many times since. She said, "Why would you do that for me, after everything?" I told her the truth. "Because you're my sister, and I don't actually want to see your life fall apart over a juice bar, but I'm not going to pretend the cottage is a conversation. It isn't. That part is already decided, and it was decided 4 years before Mom's stroke, by a woman who apparently understood this family better than any of us wanted her to." I want to pause again for just a moment because I know some of you are wondering what happened next, and I want to tell you honestly, I didn't orchestrate what happened next. I want to be very clear that I did not set out to punish my sister, and everything that follows in this section happened because of choices Renata made entirely on her own, at a distance from me, over the following 2 years. Renata took the $18,000, she signed the loan agreement, and then, according to my father, who by this point had become, almost accidentally, my only real source of information about that side of the family, Trent's juice bar franchise opened 6 months later, undercapitalized from the start, in a strip mall outside Charlotte that also housed a struggling nail salon and a shuttered Blockbuster. It lasted 14 months. The lease wasn't renewed. Trent, it turned out, had also taken out a separate, larger loan against a truck he owned and a small inheritance from his own grandfather, without telling Renata the full extent of it, and when the business folded, that debt came due all at once. My father told me, in the flat, careful voice he'd started using whenever he discussed Renata, that Trent had moved out of their apartment that winter, and that the wedding, which had been set for the following spring, had been quietly called off. Renata moved back to Belhaven that same winter, into my parents' house, my father's house now, since our mother's death, and took a job at a real estate office downtown. The same firm, coincidentally, that had once helped her photograph the cottage for a listing she never had the right to make. She repaid the $18,000 in full, on schedule, over the following 3 years. I want to note that clearly because it matters to me. My sister is not, at her core, a person who steals. She is a person who was taught, from the time she was very small, that being loved and being seen were the same transaction, and she built an entire adult life around chasing that transaction wherever she could find it, including, apparently, inside a house that was never hers. I did not gloat about any of this. I did not call to check in and see how the collapse of the business was going. I heard about it the way you hear about weather in a town you used to live in, secondhand through my father, at a slight remove, and mostly I just felt a tired kind of sadness that didn't feel anything like the satisfaction I'd half expected to feel. There was one part of the fallout I hadn't anticipated, and it came from an unexpected direction. My Aunt Ferris, it turned out, had lent Renata and Trent nearly $9,000 of her own retirement savings the previous spring, quietly, without telling my father or me, in the same way people in that family seem to specialize in quiet, unspoken financial entanglements. When the business folded, that money went with it, and Ferris, a woman who had spent 30 years teaching second grade and had never had much to spare in the first place, found herself having to push back her retirement by 2 additional years to make up the shortfall. I only learned about this because Ferris herself told me, sitting on my porch one Sunday afternoon, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "I should have asked more questions before I wrote that check," she said. "I think I wanted to be the fun aunt for once. I think I wanted Renata to think well of me the way she never seemed to think of you." She laughed a little sadly at her own honesty. Funny how that works out. I told her I understood the impulse better than she might expect, and I did. It is a particular kind of ache, wanting to matter to someone who has decided, consciously or not, that you're a supporting character in their life. I think most families have at least one person quietly making that trade, and most of the time nobody notices until the bill comes due. Word moved through Belhaven the way it always did in a town that size, not maliciously, not as gossip exactly, but as the ordinary traffic of small-town knowing. People at the harvest supper and the hardware store and the Presbyterian coffee hour eventually understood, in the loose, second-hand way small towns understand most things, that the beach house everyone had always associated with the Voss family had, in fact, gone to the quiet daughter who still lived nearby and kept the porch painted, and not to the daughter who'd once tried to list it without the right to do so. I never corrected anyone's version of events. I never needed to. The cottage itself, still standing, still mine, said everything that needed saying. While all of that was happening at a distance, I was, quietly and without announcement, building something of my own. I want to walk you through this part slowly, because it's the part of the story I'm proudest of, and it has almost nothing to do with my sister at all. 2 years after my mother's death, I closed my Portland practice and moved my business to Bellhaven, into a small storefront office 2 doors down from Marcus Feld's building above the pharmacy. I began renovating the Coast Road cottage myself, on weekends at first, then full-time once the move was complete, replacing the porch boards my grandmother had asked me to fix the very Saturday I found her, restoring the original cedar shingles instead of the vinyl siding a previous contractor had once suggested, building a small greenhouse off the kitchen where I now start seedlings every March, the way Grandma June used to. I hired a carpenter named Owen Marsh to help with the porch and the greenhouse frame, a quiet, steady man in his 50s who had spent 30 years building boats before his hands started giving him trouble, and he switched to houses instead. We worked alongside each other for the better part of a year before either of us said much of anything beyond measurements and material lists. And somewhere in that year, without either of us quite naming it, we became something like partners. Not the loud, declarative kind you announce at a family dinner, but the quiet, load-bearing kind that simply holds. My Aunt Ferris, who had watched the whole funeral scene unfold with the casserole dish and said nothing at the time, showed up at the cottage unannounced one Sunday about 3 years after my mother's death, sat with me on the porch, and said, "I should have said something that day. I'm sorry I didn't." I told her it was all right, and mostly, I meant it. She comes now most Sundays in the summer, and we sit on that porch together, and it has become, without either of us planning it, its own kind of ritual. My father visits too now, several times a year, and something in him has softened in a way I didn't expect. He helped Owen and me build a small stone path down to the water 2 summers ago, working slowly, his hands less sure than they used to be, and at the end of that day, he sat on the porch step and said, "Your grandmother would have loved watching you do this." It was the closest thing to an apology I ever got from him, and I've decided to let it be enough, not because I owe him that grace, but because I've chosen it. We have a dog now, Owen and I, a rescue mutt named Clover, who sleeps on the porch in the summer and by the wood stove in the winter, and who has never once, in 4 years, cared whether I won a science fair or a dance recital, which is, in its own small way, the most restful kind of love I've ever known. Last spring, I turned the little detached shed behind the cottage, the one my grandmother used to store gardening tools in, into a proper potting shed and small workshop. With a workbench Owen built me out of reclaimed dock planking and a row of shelves for seed trays under a south-facing window. I spend most Saturday mornings out there now, hands in soil, radio tuned to the same classical station my grandmother used to listen to while she cooked, and I think, more often than I expected to, about how strange and quiet an inheritance can be. Not a dramatic reveal in a lawyer's office, though there was one of those too, but a whole accumulated way of living, passed down mostly through habit and patience, and the simple act of someone deciding years in advance that you were worth protecting. I started a small scholarship 2 years ago through the Bellhaven Regional High School Science Department, funded modestly out of the Trust's own investment growth, for a student each year building an independent science project outside of the standard curriculum, the kind of project I always tell the committee that might not get much attention at home, but deserves it anyway. We call it the June Voss Prize. I have not told Renata about it. I don't think she'd understand why it matters to me the way it does, and I've stopped needing her to. I want to talk to you directly for a moment, if you've made it this far. If you are the one in your family who was handed the casserole dish while someone else got the deed, if you're the one who documents things quietly, who gets called the responsible one, in a tone that somehow still manages to sound like an insult, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't owe anyone an explanation for the boundaries you build. You don't owe your family a performance of forgiveness on their timeline instead of your own. Setting a boundary and refusing to hand someone something they didn't earn is not revenge. That's not cruelty. That's architecture. It's the same discipline I learned in my own profession. You don't tear down what's wild in a person or a piece of land in order to control it. You just decide, calmly, deliberately, what gets to grow where, and you let the rest hold its own shape. Family is not simply the people who share your blood. Family is who shows up, who asks the follow-up question, who sits still long enough to hear the answer, who quietly builds you a life raft years before you'll ever need it and never once mentions it, because they understood, better than anyone else in the house, exactly what kind of house it was. I loved my mother. I have made peace, mostly with my father. I have even, in my own limited way, made peace with my sister, who still lives in Bellhaven, who I see at the grocery store sometimes, who nods at me now instead of looking away. We are not close. I don't think we ever will be, and I've stopped waiting for that particular ending. But I am no longer angry, and I think that's its own kind of resolution, quieter than the one you might have been expecting. Some things don't come with a dramatic confrontation in a boardroom or a courtroom or a ballroom full of witnesses. Sometimes the truth simply sits in a filing cabinet above a pharmacy for 4 years, waiting patiently for the exact moment it's needed, and then it simply is what it is, and nobody has to raise their voice at all. The cracked casserole dish, by the way, still sits on a shelf in my kitchen at the cottage. I kept it, not out of bitterness. I use it actually every autumn to bring a dish to the harvest supper at the same white clapboard church where we buried my mother. It holds a very good scalloped potato recipe, if you're curious. Some things don't break the way you expect them to. They just turn out never to have been what you thought they were in the first place. That's my story. If this reminded you of a boundary you've been putting off, I hope you'll go set it, gently and firmly, exactly the way my grandmother would have. Thank you for being here with me. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe. I share stories like this every day, and I'd love to know, down in the comments, would you have kept the casserole dish?